least your head doesn't chat.
All right. Thanks, everyone. So I am Jason Sloan. I am Assistant General Counsel here at the Copyright Office, and I'm moderating our next panel called Matching Musical Works to Sound Recordings and Measuring Success. We've already heard a bit about that a big part of handling unclaimed royalties has to do with identifying the sound recordings that are played on digital services and matching them to their underlying musical compositions and identifying and locating the copyright owners of those compositions. So this panel is going to provide an overview of that issue and discuss current methods and perspectives from our esteemed panel, including the role of technology, how success can be measured, existing challenges, things like that. I want to thank all of our panelists for being here. I'm just going to introduce you all real quick. Starting to my left, we have Ed Arrow, Senior Vice President of Global Digital Administration at Universal Music Publishing Group. He is also the chair of the MLC Operations Advisory Committee. Next to him is Terry Boisnal. Did I have that right? Close? Okay. Director of Deployment and Implementation at DataClef. Next is Bill Coulter, Vice President and General Counsel at Music Reports, MRI. Then we have Jay Gress, Senior Vice President and Head of Copyright at Sony Music Entertainment. Then Ali Lieberman, Director of Business Process and Product Management at Sound Exchange. Vicki Nauman, Founder of Cross Border Works. John Razzo, Senior Vice President of Client Services at Harry Fox. And as you heard this morning, the MLC recently announced that Harry Fox is going to be one of their primary vendors. And last but not least, we have Sarah Rosenbaum, Music Counsel at Google, and she is also a board member and treasurer of the DLC. And just as a reminder, full bios for all of our panelists are in the agenda handout, which is also on our website. So let's get started. Before we get too deep into the meat of matching, Vicki, can you start us off with a short introductory roadmap of the data lifecycle, what it looks like from getting music onto the digital service to getting paid when the music gets played?
Yeah, absolutely. So before we did a prep call on this, and we started kind of pulling apart what's happening now, where some of the problems occur, and we realized it would be really helpful to have a visual aid. So when you checked in, there's a flowchart like this. And so this is really designed to level set everyone's understanding of a very high level of how data flows. So let's first look at the blue side, which is the master recording. The performing artists work with a label or an admin platform. That's where the ISRC gets assigned. The ISRC then is attached through distribution into the DSP, different business models. It gets monetized and used in a service. That same code and the same reporting structure comes back out to the rights holder. So what we have is this kind of neat loop of how data moves through the system. On the other side, it is composition. And again, I know there's lots of really big publishing brains in the room. This does not take into consideration everything about publishing. But at a very high level, Michael's laughing, at a very high level, it is showing how data flows. And then we're going to talk about where some of the errors occur. So you're a songwriter. You write a song. You get an ISWC issued from your performing rights organization. Now we know there's an average of 9 songwriters per song, so that's replicated for each song, 8 to 9 times. That is then delivered in a feed from publisher and admin platform into a rights administration company, and also oftentimes simultaneous to a DSP. So we can sometimes have 2 different feeds of the data going out to rights owners and to DSPs. Then inside the music service, inside the DSP, the music is used and monetized. The reporting that comes back out is for the ISRC. It does not include the ISWC. And we heard from Mark Isherwood this morning, there's some really positive movements around DDEX and feeding these things both through the system. But once they get out of monetization, that's where the matching occurs. That's where there's an amalgamation of ISRC, ISWC, there could be IPI codes, company-specific identifiers. So we have this collection of identifiers, including semantic matching of, J hyphen Z, JAYZEE, all of these kinds of things. At the Rights Administration Company in the U.S., that's where matching, claims, and conflicts are all handled. After the matching is done, then there's a report that comes out, ISWC, goes to the publisher or the admin platform, and then back to the songwriter. And so, just looking at these two, you can see that the publishing one has data changes hands a lot more frequently. There's a lot more room for error, and we're going to kind of pull this apart a little bit today and talk about where some of the errors occur.
Thank you, Vicki. Sarah, can you build on that roadmap? I know you're at MRI previously, currently at Google. Can you elaborate on what the data flow looks like at the digital services, where they're getting the data from, what's happening with the data while it's there before it gets matched or sent to a vendor?
Sure, and actually I'd like to just make a few overarching comments first. First of all, just to reiterate why we're going over all of these data flows that happen before data gets to a matching vendor or would get to the MLC is because I think that we need to temper our expectations. The matching problem is not going to be solved just through advancements in matching technology. A lot of what is going right or going wrong and what can go right is what's going to happen in the ecosystem before the data ever arrives at a matching vendor. And so I think it's critical that we go through the different stopping points and who touches the data and what opportunities we have to make improvements at each of those stages. So just to explain why we're talking about everything that happens before we get to the actual matching process. And also just as an opening comment from a DSP perspective, I want to just say that we're going to talk about the complications and how messy this is and the headaches that come out of this data matching process. But I just want to remind everyone what we're fighting for here and why this is a positive thing and why we're doing this. As you heard on some of the earlier panels, technology kind of brought down the floodgates for creators. It allowed folks who, previously were not able to break through those barriers to release their music to the public. This came with a ton of complications because you have this massive scale of music now entering the ecosystem, and you have, as Vicki mentioned, this increasing number of fragmentations of rights ownerships and writers on each composition. And what this did is, if you think about a traditional music store where you would have consignment and you would actually have to prove to the record store owner that you could sell records before you get space on that shelf, the physical shelf. The digital world, you don't need to show that up front. Everyone gets a chance to be put on the digital shelf for sale. Unfortunately, for the music services, that came with a lot of liability. Because a lot of those creators that were entering the ecosystem were not aware of what metadata was. They didn't know that they needed to provide that information in order to get paid or to get licensed. And so we were in this conundrum where we had to either stop carrying all of that extra digital shelf space and incurring that liability, or continue to take the risk of leaving that shelf space open and letting everyone have a chance. So you'll sometimes hear this referred to as the democratization of the record store. So we are really pleased that MMA has provided an opportunity to, cut off some of that liability so that that digital shelf space can remain open and we can address this data issue in a more thoughtful and less time-pressured environment. And so, this is our goal, and we're thankful that that digital shelf space is going to remain open. And now we need to figure out, how we do this process better. So.
Do you want to speak at all to the data flow through the services before we move on?
Google's a bit unique in that respect. So I may want to touch on that a little bit later when we get into authoritativeness of data and
Sure.
the actual matching process, because I think it will be easier for folks to understand how Google deviates in that way once they hear kind of what the process of matching is. But we definitely have a unique approach where we rely on what the rights owner tells us they own instead of relying on third-party sources of data that may or may not be correct. But if we can circle back on that point, that would be great.
Great. Bill, we're obviously going to dig into the details here, but can you give kind of a very high-level introduction to, we've touched on this in the earlier panels, but, what is matching? What are the different types of matches that have to be made? What does a matching vendor actually do? And kind of give a introduction to that to some people who may not be familiar.
Sure. So I'm Bill Coulter. I'm the Vice President and General Counsel of Music Reports, which is trademarked Music Reports, not MRI. MRI is something you do when you have a very bad injury. Please don't use that acronym anymore. And I can sort of lead off from where she was because, the way Music Reports has operated for the last, 15 years or so, we have been the vendor, the back office provider for virtually every DSP that has ever launched in the U.S. for on-demand streaming, in addition to serving the television industry and the radio industry and various other parts of the music ecosystem. But and it's much more than just matching. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into running the licensing and accounting administration infrastructure for anyone who wants to use music in any commercial way in the United States at least. And the way we work with DSPs generally is fairly straightforward. A DSP must go and get rights to use the master recordings in their streaming service. So they go out and they do a variety of agreements with master recording owners and distributors, the major labels, the big aggregators generally. It isn't that many licenses you need to do to get the vast majority of recordings available. And then they send the metadata related to those recordings to us and say, these are the recordings that we have the rights to use on the master side. What can we use from a publishing perspective? We then take that entire set of recordings, and of course it's updated constantly as new recordings come into the ecosystem, and we create a sort of shadow repertoire of their available catalog. And we consistently and constantly match it against music publishing records in our Songdex registry and to other forms of music publishing information that come in all the time. For instance, we check the records of the Copyright Office on a regular basis. Through a proprietary matching process, we continuously match sound recordings to musical compositions using syntax matching and leveraging whatever unique identifiers we can. But perhaps the most complicated part of the whole process is the process of creating the musical composition database against which to do the matching in the first place. We've talked about the fragmented ownership of musical compositions. One of the technical challenges that doesn't get a lot of press in that is that, let's say you've got a band with 4 members who equally contribute to the writing of a song, and they each decide to have their own music publishing administrator. You're going to receive 4 different sets of data, if you're lucky enough to get flows of data from those publishing administrators. And they're going to come in different formats at different times with different artifacts and different problems. And you're going to have to reconcile those 4 shares and recognize that they're talking about the same musical composition, compile them into a whole that hopefully equals 100% ownership, and then store that record for the process of matching to musical or sound recordings that come through the ecosystem. So there's a huge amount of really detailed work that goes into it. It's a ton of complexity. It's a lot of iterative systems. It isn't any one thing, but that's a brief overview of it.
Great, thank you, Bill. Ed, coming from Universal, can you maybe give an overview of the publisher perspective here on this data lifecycle and matching and how you ensure the musical works in your catalog are getting properly matched and paid out?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can think of this process as sort of a series of inputs and outputs, right? The inputs are the information delivered by the record labels to the DSP with the sound recording data, the information delivered by publishers to either the DSP or the service handling the administration on behalf of the service, explaining what they control and how to pay them, and then an output, then at the service, the data matching, and then the output being the royalties ultimately paid out. So for music publishers, the major music publishers and some of the large independents, we use a file format which was discussed earlier today called Common Works Registration, or CWR. And that file is as the name suggests, is a one-size-fits-all file format. It's utilized to advise our shares, our claims, to music rights organizations all over the world. And for many compositions that we control just maybe one of many shares. Maybe we just control one of many writers. And we may also control just a limited number of territories. The CWR file will contain everything we control in every territory around the world. So it may say that we control one writer's share, 25%, We control that share in the US, Canada, and the UK, and then it will show that share that we control, that 25%, both under performance rights and mechanical rights. And then each recipient of that file has to parse the information that is relevant to them. So if we're submitting a file like that to HFA, for example, they'll just look at the mechanical rights share for the US only and log that claim in their system and ignore the rest of the file. In creating these files, it's very important for us to put in the proper identifiers. Now, when a song is brand new, when we first submit it for CWR, we usually don't have an ISWC yet because that will be created by the society after we submit CWR to them, and we're submitting CWR to everyone at the same time. So we may have to supplement that information later on. But we will put in IPI codes, which are unique identifiers for writers and publishers, so an administrator can properly link, if they need to, the publishers to other songs in their system with the same publisher. It's important to think about this in terms of people talk about technology a lot, and I think Sarah was trying to point out before. Whatever technology we use, getting the data correct up front is the most important thing. If we don't get that right, the technology won't even matter. Now, publishers other than those who can handle the CWR format will probably use other, or do use other formats to deliver songs. I think John and Bill can probably speak to those formats, but I think you can go, I know you can go online and register your works that way. They may accept certain spreadsheet templates for registration as well.
Great, thank you. And Jay, basically the same question coming from Sony. Can you give a little color to the record label perspective and how your data fits into this life cycle?
Great. Thanks, Jason. I really appreciate being asked to be here to give the label perspective on some of this stuff. And I think Vicky's chart here, or our chart, gives me just the right lead in, because when you look at this chart, and I know we're focused mainly on streaming, but on the composition side, I don't see label listed here anywhere. And so I have to point that out. And I guess that's why I'm here today. So from the label perspective, we do play a key role, and we've traditionally handled the mechanical licensing for physical and then for downloads. We also license other uses such as video and all the different things that labels like to do with songs. And so there are two ways I think that that we play a role. One of them is we are sort of, in many cases, typically the originator of the metadata into this life cycle, in terms of definitely, obviously, the master and sound recording. But the labels, as they prepare a release and they record songs, they work with the artists and producers to get the label copy information, and also to find out who the writers likely are and who the publishers may or may not be. And that's part of it. So we send to the DSPs, we send usually via DDEX, ERN, the label copy type metadata. But there's also, I did make a plea to complicate Vicky's chart, but it didn't happen. But I'll speak to it now, that there is a simultaneous process where the labels are working to license all these songs for their requirements and their liability. Labels come at this with a bit of a different perspective in some cases than DSPs, in that, when my team's working on a song for Columbia Records and their artist, this song has to be released. It has to be released on a certain day. It's very important. And when we clear and license, we pre-clear, we endeavor to pre-clear all our songs. We take that information from the label, and we reach out to the publishers. We do a lot of research. It's a lot of hands-on work that we do. Traditionally, we have not worked in an MLC or a society kind of environment. So the licensing work has been work by work, share by share type of work, reaching out directly to who the likely publisher is. And I think through all that simultaneous work that we do, and with a sense of urgency, because we're not sort of trying to, in a way we are manually matching, but we're also trying to clear and ensure that we have the rights to release our records before release as much as possible. With that in mind, I think we add some speed and timeliness and urgency to the process. And I do think we're adding some of these matches, song to ISRC, with this work when we reach out to a publisher and we say, hey, Ed, is this your song? What's your share? And the publisher comes back to us later. They're storing that information. Another point is that many times when we reach out for new songs, the publishers aren't familiar with the fact that the song exists or has been recorded. So there's a time lag there, and we work with the publishers extensively on that. So I think both we source some of the initial metadata into the life cycle, and we also do a lot of heavy lifting in terms of linking these things and sharing that information with several parties.
I should have. I'm sorry. I should have mentioned. I just want to supplement what you're saying, Jay, because you talked about that you were the originator of the original match between an ISRC and an ISWC, a song and a composition, and that when we send CWR files, we do include any ISRCs that we have with those files, and we also send supplementary files of ISRCs as we obtain additional ISRCs. Although there's a question as to whether or not we would be considered authoritative for that data.
Yeah, I just want to point out too, you were talking about some of the, the labels are obviously one point on this chart where we can look and say, well, perhaps you're here to play a gatekeeping function and that, you're the original releaser of this metadata, and should you be coordinating with publishers to get that filled out as much as possible before it goes out in the ecosystem. But, I think we all oversimplify each other's areas, and there was a panel I was on with a high-level executive from a major label, and, I was giving him a hard time about, why are you releasing things without the proper publishing metadata? And he's like, Sarah, have you ever waited up till 3 a.m. to get a Kanye West album delivered? He was like, when he shows up at 3 a.m. to drop that album off and it has to go out tomorrow, he's like, I'm not asking him if all the ISWCs for his writers are properly populated in the metadata. I don't even think that's a question I can ask. I'd probably get fired if I didn't put the album out for that reason. And I think that's unfortunate. I mean, that's the point that I'm trying to make, is that our expectations need to change. That shouldn't be an unreasonable question. It can't be one person advocating or standing up. It has to be a village of people making this the norm and saying, no, we're actually not going to put your album out or pay you until you give us this data. But I know that it's hard, and we all think that everyone should, be doing more, but it really has to be a group effort.
Let me add, too, that absolutist solutions don't tend to work in the music business because there's such a huge amount of complexity and special use cases. And we all have to give each other a little bit more slack in this process and acknowledge that a time lag exists in the way music information moves through the system. I mean, you made the point, Ed, that if the data isn't right up front, nothing is going to work. I disagree, I think, just with the way you constructed the sentence, in the sense that as the dialogue between you just shows, it's impossible to have the data right up front because the songwriters haven't necessarily agreed their splits or sent their information through. What's important is that through that iterative process, you continue to supplement the information you're exchanging between each other until you get to perfection, until you arrive at authority, and that is the process by which we refine the data to the point where it can be actioned for licensing and accounting purposes.
Sure. I mean, obviously, in most cases, we do have the split information, so that's a minority of cases. Although sometimes it happens on big songs, and it's a real problem. But the point is, don't deliver anything incorrect.
Well, and I think you also have to look at the length of time it takes to get an ISWC. Sometimes it can be a year after the song has been written and released. And so then we have this composition that's out in the wild getting monetized, and there isn't a core unique identifier that's associated with it.
So that's why we need to have a period of time built into the administrative infrastructure that allows for those kinds of predictable lags. And one of the best things about the MMA is that it sets that time at 36 months. Right? There's 3 years in which the MLC has time to do its work, to assemble that information, to refine that information, to make sure that they've got it right before the money gets liquidated by market share and everyone throws up their hands and says we can't do anymore. So that's the kind of structure that we need here, is some cushion of time that allows this administrative work to get done in an imperfect environment so that the writers can get paid accurately.
And for comparison, that timeline used to be somewhere around 2 or 3 days. You know, you get the label metadata, the album's going to be released in a few days, and this entire process that we're talking about of matching had to take place within a few days at, you know, a vendor internally in order to get licensed on time. And we're thankful, I think, that time pressure has been removed so that we can actually get this right.
The whole process has gotten faster, the volume much bigger, and actually with the barrier of entry reduced, a lot less knowledgeable of the people doing the delivery as well too. So all of this came together and resulted in, you know, a SoundCloud. I could write something right now, and in 5 minutes it'll be available. And there's unless everything else that we just talked about has taken place, it's not illegal use.
And one thing we're, and I know we're going to talk about MDX later, but one thing we're working on to address this data lag issue is helping along the conversation between record labels and publishers to exchange the data before the recording's released, so that, you know, after usage, months after usage, when it's being reported to a matching vendor, all of that information is making its way through the supply chain. So there's really not much a matching vendor needs to do, because you're getting the recording data up front, you're getting the publishing data up front. It's the authoritative sources making the link between the sound recording and the musical work, so that when it makes its way to the matching vendor and ultimately through royalty payment, all of that data is preserved consistently. So having all of that captured and centralized and transparent upfront before release has been really effective.
Great. Just since it was just raised, I want to stay on this topic for a moment. Can we talk a little bit more about ISWCs and what the issue is there, and why there's the delay in getting it released and the impact that has on this issue? Ed, do you maybe want to?
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on it. I can just tell you that the ISWCs are go ahead.
I can help.
I was gonna say,
Please.
they're assigned by societies. They're not, you know, I just want to say,
No,
ISR, I just
not
want to say,
exactly.
ISRCs are assigned by record companies. So they have a list, I think, of codes that they can use. Jay, tell me if I'm wrong. And then they assign the ISRC when the recording is at some point in the creation process. Publishers, we don't have that option. Go ahead.
Well, and there's one rights holder for the master recording and multiple for.
Right, but at the end of the day, there should be just one SRC for each composition, regardless of how many owners there are.
Absolutely correct, because what the ISWC really is the composition. It's got nothing to do with exploitation, and that's where the business has failed, not just in the United States, globally. I administer the ISWC on behalf of CSAC. CSAC's the administering body. I actually supply the back-end services and the support for them. And what happens is the way the registration processes have evolved has held back the ability to put that ISWC out at the start. So it was encouraging this morning to hear the MLC is trying to educate, is trying to do this right up front. CSAC is also doing this very, very proactively. Well, I wouldn't say proactively anymore. They're trying to address this very, very quickly. But the problem is, how do you get back? Because the entry point where everything starts to happen in our business is when the recording goes out, when somebody hears that song. We've all heard today how you have to back up and get the shares, get all the information to support that. That doesn't drive the ISWC. The business processes PROs have in place through the CWR are what's resulted in that delay. It's not that it has to be there. So what CSAC is trying to do now with a number of the major publishers is get the ISWC right away. So when they actually send CWR files in, what a new initiative that's happening is ISWC will come in from the publisher, not from the societies.
So we will be self-assigning them. We'll have, like the record companies do
You will
now?
ask for them
Oh, we'll still have to ask.
Yeah.
And how long would it take to receive
within
them?
24 hours.
And-
So
and
there's
it would-
API
and it would be a
services.
file that we would
Yep.
send out and receive a file back.
Yes, Sony in the UK is actually in
The risk of getting duplicate numbers when you do that, because you have different, you have joint owners who might all be requesting at
Right.
the same time.
What if we and Sony send you a file on the same day? And some of those songs are the same song.
They will get matched and you will get back the original ISWC. The ISWC that was there first is a title and it's the creators. So if I'm looking at a title and two creators, no problem, give it an ISWC. it now goes, and somebody else goes from Sony and Universal's filling out the other half, they're going to come back in and say the same thing. If they come back in and say, oh no, there's a third writer, in a PRO world with that composition, that's a new composition. There's now 3 shareholders to that title. It's different. There's business processes in place to rectify that afterwards.
Right.
But now we're talking.
Yeah, that makes it tricky, because if one publisher doesn't have one of the writers because they don't know, then you're going to get 2 different files that you don't reconcile against each other, and you're going to assign 2 ISWCs to the same song.
Yes. And then you have to deal with that afterwards. You're relying on the PROs now to recognize that and deal with it.
But
Typically,
that,
the PRO.
right, but that is the risk of doing it fast.
That's
and
correct.
so you have to just balance it, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we've definitely waded into this a bit, but I want to bring in our full panel here, whoever wants to jump in on this. Some of you have already started talking about it, but I just want to kind of make sure we get for everyone all of your individual perspectives here on matching, various approaches and methodologies, how you measure success, some of the challenges you've faced. And it'd be really helpful if, in discussing this, some of you can speak to things like how you use automated processes versus manual ones. A big one I want to make sure we talk about is how you deal with conflicting data and how you evaluate the authoritativeness of data when you have it coming from different sources. At what point are you confident enough in a match that you call it a match and pay royalties on it, and what kind of standards and criteria you use for this? John, do you may want to kick us off? And I definitely want to hear from everyone on this.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges there.
Yeah, I know. It was a big open-ended question, I know.
Yeah, so it's funny. We talk. This is the matching panel, but the matching part isn't the hardest part. It's having the right data and organized in a database. As Bill was saying, the challenge is you get multiple sources of partial shares of a song, and you have to match them together. Even in the example for the ISWC, sometimes there's a writer missing. And so that creates a new composition in the database. So we could successfully match to one, but the 25% share that's lingering on a duplicate song isn't getting paid. So it's matched, but it's just not complete, right? So duplicate songs is a big problem, right? ISWC helps resolve that, but now I'm also hearing an example where potentially there's 2 different ISWCs, what is essentially the same composition. So we will never get to perfect, but and there's only so much manual review you could do. So, I mean, automation is necessary, and that's where 2 different numbers coming in from 2 different sources, where the DSP sends along an ISRC code along with all the artist related and performance metadata, but and then sitting on our system, the only 2 things that overlap are a title. Titles are not unique. So I think I heard. Hello was an example used earlier today. I always use one because there's a Metallica song, a U2 song, and I think there's a 3 Dog Night song. I don't know, Paul Williams composition. So which one is it? And then it becomes interesting when those artists cover each other's songs too. So you end up start building things where you have knowledge database where if artist is Coldplay, and a regular writer for Coldplay like. Chris, what's his name, is in our database. If a title matches, artist is Coldplay, writer could be one of this person. It improves the odds of a match. And then you start playing the game of, well, how close to 100% do you need? Because 100%, you probably won't get a satisfactory response. So then you lower it, but then you start getting bad matches, and so you're constantly toying with those algorithmic. No, that's not correct. Changes in order to find the right place, because the HFA sits in the middle of a DSP, as well as we have affiliated publishers that we work with, right? And so there's a push and pull of which way that algorithm should move, right? I want accurate, I want fast, I want right, I need license coverage, right? So you're getting pushed both ways to get that. So. And then, well, I could talk all day about authoritative too, and I think there's several people who want to talk about it well, so I won't dodge into that.
You can say a word about it. We definitely want to hear from everyone.
Well, we just make it simple in that unless you own it or are assigned to own it, we don't take it as authoritative, which becomes a challenge with the record companies, because the record companies will pass it through, but I don't know if it's correct because I don't know if it's changed. And frequently it is, but at the same time, it's not the latest nor it's direct, and I can't rely on it. So.
Trust me, John, it's correct.
But I should add, so one of the things we have, there's a, the whole other thing is I have publishers when we have, so then we get letters of directions all the time about changes, and I have two people that I trust completely saying, hey, we've taken over this catalog. Well, my system says it belongs to them. I need to go ask them. You don't have to go ask them. I need that change today. I know you trust me. So it's like, well, I can't until I get authoritative release. I can't really. So there becomes, and that those are conversations we have under best practices conversations.
So this is a theme that was discussed a little bit earlier in the day, that there's technological problems and there's people problems, as it was described earlier. But I would try to give us all a bit of credit on the people side, right? We're all just trying to do the best job that we can. We're all in this to try and make this work for everybody. Let's think about the incentives that drive people in not the people themselves, right? The incentives that drive each rights owner are to assert authority for something so that they can get paid on it, so they can assert authority over it. But their assertions are not always correct, despite their best intentions. And the incentives they have is to do it as quickly and as aggressively as they can to try and get paid as much as they can. It's just a mathematical fact. It's not an indictment of anyone. And so this system is one in which we have to really think about how we've constructed the system to maximize the best incentives in the marketplace. And we talked about how economics incentivize a lot of behavior by publishers, and especially independents and self-published artists, to try and provide their information into the system. But the farther you go down the tail, the less professional those people are in terms of asserting rights. They may not be as careful as some of the larger music publishers are in doing this work. And so it's incumbent on whatever party is running the registry to set up policies and procedures that take every claim that comes in as nothing more than a claim. Authority doesn't exist. You can make different judgment calls about whether you trust someone or don't, whether they're a big publisher or a small publisher, but at the end of the day, the registry has to have a point of view and to assemble its registry based on the information that it believes to be correct and stand behind that when it makes mistakes. That's really, I think, the essence of how these things can get done right. And I think it's one of the core problems that has undermined industry-wide attempts to build these kinds of databases in the past. It's very difficult to get competing rights owners to cooperate fully, where at the end of the day, they view this as a zero-sum game. It's all about market share, and I'm going to push my market share as high as I can.
Yeah, and that's exactly the win with the MLC, is there's now committees to make those industry-wide decisions rather than it being fought over of, for me, do it this way, for you, do it that way. And it becomes, that competition goes away.
Sarah, did you want to?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Google's tried various approaches to this and sometimes has gotten yelled at by rights owners for doing it the wrong way. So, we've ended up in a way that we think everyone is comfortable with. And I'm not talking about necessarily in the 115 world, but just generally speaking, we're getting a restart here. So just looking at other areas of like direct licensing. I think you're constantly hearing there's not enough data, we need more data, which is true for the long tail of creators. We do need some data from them. But I think sometimes we think that more is always more in this space, and that's not always correct. Collecting every bit of metadata that you can get your hands on and then trying to reconcile that is not going to come to the best outcome. For example, there was a time when Google would, collect claims and metadata. And for example, a creator who actually is saying, I own this, would tell us, we own this is our share. But then we would receive 10 different sources of metadata from other parties that we call third-party data, and they're saying, well, that person actually owns a different percentage because, there was a mistake made somewhere out in the ecosystem as the data traveled around, and that mistake got duplicated over and over again as that data passed. And so we looked at volume and said, oh, well, if 10 people are saying, these 10 sources are saying that person's share is really different than theirs, we should override that because that's a volume overrides the rights owner. And then we would get a call from them saying, what the heck? We told you we owned 50%, and we okay? All right, cool. And so, you know, our system, as you're describing, is based only on rights owner assertions. Sure, you're going to have conflicting assertions at time, and you need a conflict resolution policy to deal with those. But we, at this point in our system, would never override now what a rights owner tells us that they are accurate percentages, even if we're getting signals from 10 other places that maybe that's different. Now, we don't ignore those signals. We have a proposer tool where we say to that rights owner, like, hey, like 10 different people are telling us this. Is that correct or not correct? But until we receive that actual assertion from them, confirming those third-party signals, we don't take that as truth for accounting and payment purposes. So.
And so touching on, and I think you mentioned it earlier, the whole issue of overlap identification, it's very important to have granular, precise rights management systems because you need to track rights across time period, across territory, across right type, performance versus mechanical, because if you're getting two CWRs coming in, one's a sub-publisher in the UK saying they own this share, and another one is a US publisher administrating in the US saying they own the same share, your systems have to be able to identify that's actually not a conflict. So I think someone in an earlier panel was talking about 3D rights, and having a system that's able to handle that is very important when you are identifying overlaps. We're actually now looking at like 4 or 5 dimensions. So it's having that granularity, especially, you know, scale, volume. We're talking about tens of millions of performance lines being processed each month. So having systems that can handle things precisely and at scale is very important.
Anybody else want to give general perspectives on matching methodologies and data authoritativeness? No? Terry, do you want to talk about what DataCloth is doing in that regard?
I'll stay away from
Okay.
DataCloth because I'm not here on a sales pitch today. I think that
Just trying to get different perspectives from different people.
I think the underlying problem that we face is trying to reconcile what in effect is hundreds on ISRCs for the same creation, because I'm getting different information coming in. We're at the tail end trying to reconcile a lot of this and get money out when you hit the matching end. And you have, I'll use Fernell Williams, Happy. There's over 700 ISRCs and 2 ISWCs. There's the original creation and the one for the film. How do you pick them? The shares are different. So you have to worry about the different territories, the different rights, because wherever it's getting released, it's getting other ISRCs, and this is just bringing more data in. So the reliance now on having these cross identifiers is critical. It's the only way you can do it. Years ago, we used to be able to do this textually. You'd start with a title, you'd start with a name. You can't do that anymore. You have to start with the identifier and then qualify with the title, with the name. Did I get the right one? Oh, am I in the right territory? Is it the right share split? You have the actual creations where, based on the territory, the original publishing changes. So you can't even always rely on that. It doesn't happen a lot, but it's things that you have to consider when you're trying to reconcile all of this data. And it causes a lot of duplication or false duplication. And that's the hard part, is reconciling that. So that's what's pushing things like you have to have claiming portals, you have to have conflict resolution processes. That business, the digital world hit the business so hard and so quickly it couldn't keep up. What's encouraging now is we do not have restrictions very much anymore in technology. We have the technology, we know how to do it. We don't have to worry about 15 years ago, PRO systems were crashing at the knees as DSR reports came flying in. I don't know if Mark's still here, but that's kind of his fault. But, but the data brought systems to their knees, and we've gotten past that. We're able to now process, we're able to do that. So it's not a technology problem anymore. Is it time to go back and reevaluate the business processes and how we're working with the technology? That's my opinion.
So, yeah, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'll just add, I agree completely about the having clear rules about and statuses about things that are in process and are not fully matched. And for the label perspective with that, I mean, our work is very manual, direct confirmation with the rights holder or publisher. That's generally how we operate. Some processes to try to automate things. But we get the approval and license from the source directly, again, generally. But we we engaged in a best practices group, and I think there was a big benefit to that with the publishers as part of an MOU settlement, and we had rules about how we handle what we call pending and unmatched. There's a big benefit. There was a lot of collaboration and work in that environment, and I think it did work to make things better. And a key thing is that so everyone knows why something isn't paid clearly and what the statuses are. It's just something I would say, I'd chime in that's a really important part, that people aren't guessing why something is not being paid.
Agreed. It must be transparent.
Yeah, and I guess the thing is also this conversation is about the people who are in the room and talking, right? There's where it's the big companies with technology and knowledge and and very valuable catalogs, and sometimes I feel like the real core thing that we come to these conversations that are important to know is there's maybe volume-wise in dollar amount, but volume-wise in sound recording and composition. That's sort of the people who aren't in this room or not having this conversation that need to understand. As the artists on the previous panel were talking, there's a sort of a bit of a high threshold of just knowing what to do, let alone how to do it. That I think that's a big piece of what needs to be accomplished.
We have to make it easy.
Yeah.
Right. I think somebody was pointing out on that panel that you can't have a web portal that somebody goes into and it's so ridiculously complicated they get scared and run away.
Yeah.
So it's got to be a really good user interface, something that they can go and maybe log in some very fundamental information.
Very intuitive, yeah.
The first time, now they have a password. Every time they go in, that information is replicated. I don't know, I'm not going to build it here on the panel, but the point is it's got to be really user friendly and require a minimal amount of information, and maybe we have to help them a little bit on the back end.
I also think, with the MLC that, the discussion this morning I think was great about how narrow the scope is, because we can't expect the MLC to solve all of these problems. But I feel like, I sit in between the technology industry and the music industry, and I feel like this is kind of the mother of a lot of problems that we have in publishing. It has risk, it has ambiguity, it has, just all sorts of things wrapped up in it. And I think that this is also going to open up a really robust startup ecosystem that are going to start tackling some of these smaller problems, because we can't expect one or two companies to solve all of this. There are thousands of micro problems all over the world, but once we start to get this right, then I think it's really fertile ground for young companies to come in and say, like there's a company in Dublin, that Spanish Point Technologies, where they've created a matching engine that can just be dropped inside. It's all cloud-based. It can be dropped inside work environments. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And that's where I think we're really going to, post-MLC, start to see cleanup all over the world.
Ali?
I'm sorry, I don't want to sound defensive about this, but I'm going to have to go back to Los Angeles and face 130 people who have solved almost all of these problems to an enormous degree and work very diligently every day to serve a huge range of music services in these realms, whether it's creating the song database, creating the track database, matching the two together, making sure accountings go out 20 days after the close of the month. Our platform invented the process of bulk filing of accountings to creators 20 days after the close of the month. We innovated in this space repeatedly, whether it was filing notices accurately and efficiently, whether it was settling payments through electronic payments as efficiently as possible, making tools available that were both serving the largest rights owners with high technical capabilities, as well as mom and pops in the long tail able to submit information any way they can, whether it was creating a royalty services department that serves the interests of publishers and doesn't commission their royalties, but rather shifts the cost of administration to the rights user community, whether it was creating the first claiming system, makes it possible to see 60 million unmatched recordings and find your recordings very powerfully in that, and be paid immediately, retrospective to the first dollar. We and the team that supports everything Music Reports does have been in the trenches for 25 years, solving these problems again and again and again. And I think we're under-recognized for the degree to which all of these technical problems have been solved and actually work efficiently at enormous volume all day, every day.
Ali, I have a question for you about volume that we were talking about a few minutes ago. In recent comments to the Copyright Office, Sound Exchange said, I'm just going to quote here real quick, ensuring that our rights management database is always populated with the most current information about who's entitled to be paid for use of the recordings in our repertoire database and handling situations where there are overlapping claims as to who should be paid for the use of a particular recording are much larger challenges than learning about the existence of new repertoire. It's also my understanding that Sound Exchange currently has something like 140,000 royalty recipients.
I think we're close to 200,000 this year.
There you go. From all that experience at Sound Exchange, I was hoping you could speak to what is needed for to service that kind of volume, and what needs to happen to consistently maintain accurate and deconflicted ownership data when it's constantly changing.
Yeah, so there's really sort of three customer groups that need to be kept in mind. One is the high volume players. So for the majors, in order to get up-to-date rights information from them, you need APIs, you need the DDEX messages. We're working with MWN and MDX. We support ERN, moving to MLC. We have the MWN LOD message that we're working on implementing. Oh, I know. Sorry. These are all. Mark should probably take this. Yeah, sorry, a lot of acronyms. So these are all DDEX messages meant to communicate metadata, rights data, and it's really for sort of those with the technology resources available at their companies. So that's one constituent group that needs to be kept in mind. You really need to serve the volume players in that respect. There's also the middle tier, so getting up-to-date rights information for the mid-size indies. For them, they need bulk claiming. So Excel spreadsheets, is really important. Being able to upload your data in a format that works for you, that's really important in getting up-to-date information from them. And then the third, which we've talked about, is the true independents, the singer-songwriters, the creators. And for them, you need a very clean, simple, intuitive user interface where they can go in, give the information they need, and get out. So making sure that you are servicing all three of those constituent groups is very important when you're trying to manage the exchange of data and having up-to-date rights information. So keeping those three groups in mind is very important.
Great, thank you. Bill, do you want to add anything to that from your perspective?
Well, yeah, all of the above, right? It's like Obama's energy policy. We need every single avenue, all of these acronyms, all the great work that the WIPO organizations have done, that the CISAC organizations have done, that the DDEX organization has done. These are all fantastic tools. At the end of the day, it isn't a technical problem. It is a very tractable technical problem. Think about other domains in which fractional interests in huge dollar items transact all day in gigantic volume. You just have to look to New York Stock Exchange to see vastly more complicated systems at work. What we need is a system of incentives and logical processes that combine both technical aspects and human-centered aspects to work through this problem with the maximum degree of fairness and efficiency that's possible. We employ 50 IT professionals who probably handle 99.9% of all the data churn through systemic processes that work at an extremely high level of fidelity. But that 0.1% requires a great deal of attention. And so we have another 50 copyright professionals who pore over differences and contact rights owners and work through these, both on the copyright registry side of things and also on the royalty statement side of things, to make sure everything ties out and everyone's satisfied with the output of these things. And there's a great deal of rough edges in this business. It's a fact that's been inherent in the publishing business for a very long time. And the working group that came out of the pending and unmatched settlement from 2006, where the last time the record companies and the publishers got into this, there was over a quarter of $1 billion, $260 million, I believe, was the settlement. This is not a new problem, right? We're just in a place now where the volume of transactions has radically increased, but the fundamental problem of flowing the data from the rights owner community into registries that curate the data in a responsible way that the rights owner community can live with and that the rights user community can benefit from, that's the way to maximize returns to creators. At the end of the day, this is it's a set of intangible infrastructure for handling intangible property. And the whole concept of intangible property is completely arbitrary. Constitution granted us the right to create a statutory system that incentivizes creators through a bunch of rules. So all we need to do is set up a bunch of infrastructure that allows us to allocate resources to those creators in the way that maximizes the imperative of the Constitution. It's not complicated, other than we all need to get along and just work through the problem.
I'd just like to add, while the MLC has a lot of IT build ahead of it, and Richard was talking earlier about, we have 1 year to get up and running, but after that we'll have to improve over time. The good news is, having selected HFA as one of our vendors, we already have the information database. We already have a database with a significant number of musical compositions in it and matches to sound recordings. So to that degree, we hit the ground running, and I'm very happy about that.
One more thing to add too. I don't want to overlook the human resource element to all of this too, when making sure we have up-to-date rights information. I think most of us up here have teams of people who are working diligently with the rights owners and the artists and the creators to make sure that rights are up-to-date and accurate. So having a team of specialists who are familiar with the musical work publishing landscape is very important.
Thanks. Yes,
Yeah,
Sarah.
I just wanted to circle back to a question you asked earlier in your long list of questions that we didn't quite touch on yet. It was just about a match rate and what is reasonable and what should the expectations be, as you guys have mentioned.
Literally my next question.
Oh, is it? Okay. Do you want to ask
No,
it
please
first?
speak.
Okay.
No. I was going to ask exactly that. Are there industry standards,
there.
accepted norms as to match rates and how to measure them?
Yeah, because we've talked about a two-tiered matching process here, where you have an automated process that matches everything that you can in an automated fashion, and then you have the things that don't match, and you have a team of actual human beings that put their eye on that list. And typically that's prioritized by usage, so that you're paying out the highest dollar amounts first. So I could see a world where you could go down a rabbit hole and you just continue to staff, more and more human beings looking at this. But what is the point at which you draw the line, I guess, and this is a question to anyone on this panel, like, what is a reasonable match rate? We'll never get to 100%. And I think starting with a few facts first are important, and I'll ask Professor Bill this one.
Well, the one to plug in, the one piece there is then, right, so you have staff that does it, but there also are claiming tools that you put out, and the user themselves, right, because there's that, no one knows your catalog better than yourself, and so you that's where you essentially put the masses to work, because I can't have the expectation that, you have 1 million people doing it, and as a result, the person who cares the most gets to do it too. So.
Yeah, agree. So I think that's part of it is, incentivizing people, crowdsourcing that effort to get people to do it, but also just for example, Bill, I'll ask you, since you work with the data all the time, like, what percentage of a typical sound recording catalog actually has one single play or more, and what percentage has absolutely no usage whatsoever on a service? And I ask this because it's important when you're thinking about match rate. Are you thinking against an entire catalog? Because if you have a 20% match rate of an entire catalog, that might seem like an abysmal failure. But if none of the stuff that you're failing to match is actually getting one single play, how much does that matter, and how much resource should we be putting into fixing that problem?
So, there's a very steep curve to the music business, right? It's basically a 99-1 curve. 1% of the works generate 99% of the value, and 99% of the works share 1% of the value. And that curve is getting steeper all the time. It's getting steeper because the volume of new recordings coming into the ecosystem has just exploded over the last 20 years, to the point where I think about 40,000 recordings per day, well over 1 million tracks a month coming into the global ecosystem through the aggregators, through the record companies, and that doesn't even count the UGC creations, which are off the charts in terms of volume. So you've got this huge number of works flooding in, and yet there's still only, a hot 100, right? There's only so many tracks that can be the top tracks that are playing at any particular time. So it's very much a winner-take-all system. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have an obligation to try and match every single one of those tracks in the system, but it does mean that there's a very steep curve in terms of diminishing returns for the effort that you put in, John, to your point. I mean, it's absolutely fair. And, you know, to the point you were making, the closer you are to the creation of the thing, the more the easier it is for you to solve the problem, both because you're more interested, but also because you have a smaller number of releases to look after, right? So on an average an average streaming service today, there's about 50 million recordings. I would say, just based on rough numbers over the years that I've looked at this, maybe 80% of those recordings have 0 plays. 80% have 0 plays.
That's a staggering number.
Right, it's
So
a
I just think that's
staggering
where we
number.
need to start our expectation is like,
Well, also the legal goalposts have moved too, right? Every single one of those, regardless of a play or not, needed to be matched and properly licensed, right? Now we're moving to a blanket, and there's protection. So the need to match those is focused on things that get played, which that also makes the ball smaller to focus on. So
If I could just throw in one other statistic, though, this is a recent one that I thought was pretty remarkable. On a major UGC platform, over a period of time, we were able to match 99.57% of all creations. And this was a real shock to us because generally, if you're talking about the total list of assets on the catalog, you're matching, you know, maybe 25, 30% of them in terms of volume and 80% of them in terms of money. But in this particular set, we were matching 99.57% of every asset in the ecosystem. And the reason that we surmise is because in a user-generated context, everyone's reusing the big hit songs, the songs that are easily looked after, the songs that you can find. And so the problem is very multidimensional, and it's different from platform to platform.
yeah, that's just the big thing to notice is what set are we talking about, right? So so coming up with percentages is always a very difficult conversation because it's what is the 100% that we're talking about, right? So
Right. So I guess tangential to that is I guess how you measure your success and how well you're matching. Are you, we're talking about percentages of catalog, but do you look at percentages of royalties collected, percentage of streams, all of the above? I mean, what kind of metrics are kind of the industry norm here?
I just want to add one additional concept to that point because I don't want people to think that, you know, we match 80% of the royalties and then stop. That's not at all how it operates, right? On a current period basis, within 45 days after the close of a current period, we're generally able to match 80% of the royalties, just right off the bat. And so you pay those out immediately, and then the remaining 20% doesn't go into a black box. It goes into a transparent claiming system where anyone can add data to it. And of course, we're receiving huge volumes of data all day from any publisher who can send it to us electronically, through royalty accounting feedback, through just napkins that people mail to us with pieces of information on them. And over the 36 months that I mentioned earlier, we're able to take that remaining 20% and liquidate probably 80 to 90% of that. So you end up with between 3 and 5% of the pool that either turns out to be non-music or PD or just no owner ever surfaces for it.
And sorry, just to clarify those percentages, that what you were just talking about is of the royalties that come in. Right. Thank you.
But if everything was so perfect, would we be having this symposium?
we just like getting together and seeing each other.
It can
I'm
always
going to
be
respectfully decline to take the bait on that very loaded question.
It's good. It's not perfect.
All right.
Yeah, and I also feel like it's incumbent upon us that we have a major trend that's happening in the music industry, which is individual creators in their bedrooms, people without labels, people without publishers, people who are in every corner of the world who have the freedom to upload their music. And I feel like we do kind of need a North Star around that reality, because I don't think the toothpaste is going back in the tube where we only have the handful of major rights holders and there's a barrier around individual creators. And so I feel like it's a combination of things where, a lot of discussion today about education of the artistic and creative community. I think that's absolutely key. I also think that some of the portals and some of the claiming systems that we've had have been extraordinarily cumbersome for small to mid-sized publishers as well as individual writers. And we have to really accommodate this new reality of what makes up our ecosystem.
Keep anticipating my questions. So let's talk about that. First, maybe we can talk about, I don't know if maybe Ed or Jay want to talk about this, but are there particular genres or vintages or creator groups in particular that pose a particular kind of challenge for getting the data that's needed for successfully matching, and how can we address that?
I'd say, generally speaking, the more writers on a song, the more complicated it is, right? Because the more people you have to agree to something. Someone earlier on a panel described, one of the writers described a process in which songs are often written today. I say they're not written, they're evolved, right? It used to be 2 or 3 writers in a room would sit together, write a song, walk out of the room having agreed that each one has 50% or a third. And today often 2 or 3 writers get together, maybe they put a track together, then that goes to someone else who adds some kind of a top line vocal, then maybe it goes to a producer who adds something else, and then an artist does something to it, and then by the time it's released, nobody really knows who's going to claim what.
Or all 5 of those are released. And they all have
And they're all,
different splits.
right. No, and they're all released because Jay's in a hurry. So, you don't want your marketing people angry with you.
Beyonce wants the song out tomorrow.
Right. No, it's understandable. So actually, in a way, we do too, because if you don't hit your targets and it's released
we
too
do
late,
call you and
we're
you
not going to make
clear
any
it.
money together.
We do call you and you clear it. Splits to come later.
Right, absolutely. And, and again, hopefully we can get those splits, within a relatively short period of time. And as HFA and MRI not MRI, Music Reports, will tell you that they rerun. So if we don't get these shares in fast enough, for the first time they're going to make a payment for those streams, but we get it in, say, 3 months later, they'll rerun those streams against what we've submitted, make the match at that point, and pay us. The big risk is more when you never get it in, right? So if you have a 3-year period to get your shares in, after which there's going to be a distribution of Unmatched, right? Then you're subject to a market share distribution, and that's less desirable.
Yeah, all I can add is, for an example, my department recently was asked by one of our labels to assess some of the top Billboard songs for clearance. How easy would these be to clear for videos and covers? So we'd need to go clear. And when we did that assessment, it was mind-blowing. All of the top songs were 12, 15 songwriters, 17 songwriters. It was just mind-blowing. And so I would say pop music is probably one where it's becoming much more collaborative, and expanded.
Yeah, it used to be pretty much just in rap and hip hop, and now it's expanded into pop, because I think those songs are written in the same way now, using the same methodology that were established in rap and hip hop back in the day.
Right. There's a lot more sampling in pop music than there used to be, right?
But it's not just samples. Samples are often cleared prior to release. The record companies are really good at getting that done.
No, but just in terms of managing the database problem, we often demonstrate the song Grills by Nelly, which has 17 writers and 23 music publishers. Figure that one out. It's a very, very complicated situation, and we've done an analysis. You can Google music reports and number of composers, and you'll find a report that we put out a few years ago where we analyzed the hits of many decades and discovered that indeed the number of songwriters and the number of publishers on works is increasing year over year over year.
When I first got into the business, virtually every song in the catalog that I worked for at that time had 2 writers on it, and a few of them had 3. And then one day a song was delivered that had 4. And I remember my boss saying, "Oh, it's a California hot tub party."
But to correct something that Vicky said earlier, this fragmentation doesn't exist solely on the musical composition side. It's traditionally only on the musical composition side, but increasingly, this is going to be an issue for the sound recording side of things as well. Not only do companies like STEM allow for multiple owners of a recording to share ownership of the master recording and to account that amongst themselves, but we're beginning to see new markets for even subparts of songs like stems through platforms like Splice and TrackLib. So I
Maybe
think we're
take
gonna
1 second to just explain what a stem is for people. who may not know.
STEM is a component of a song, for instance, just the drum track or just the horn track, etc. And these things can now be separated and marketed either because you have the original master tapes can separate them, but I understand there's now technology can deconstruct them into their component parts and separate them and sell them that way. Perfect example, I guess, would be Old Town Road had a banjo part in it that had been taken from a Nine Inch Nails song and then repurposed through a library sold by, I think, a Dutch kid or a Belgian kid. And that circulated back into Lil Nas X's hands, got into his track, and before he knew it, he had this monster hit on his hands and needed to go and find out, oh, wait, that wasn't actually on a free library. It belongs to Nine Inch Nails, it belongs to Trent Reznor.
Thanks. As was alluded to earlier, claiming portals are part of this process, and since most of you are part of companies that have claiming portals, I want to get a sense of how they're working in terms of matching and reducing the unclaimed funds. In particular, what your experience has been. I'd also like to.
Well, I'd say, they get a lot of use. I don't think the revenue is particularly high because it's a lot of long tail stuff that's going. Usually, the way we work with bigger companies is they send us a huge file of these are ISRCs that we think are matched, and so it's done in a bulk fashion. The one by one is pretty much long tail. So someone might go and grab, these are the 50 songs I control, and these are the sound recordings I know, and it's a couple dollars. So the volume from a matching point of view is high. The revenue is generally not. That's not the user. Yeah.
Does anyone have anything to add to portals?
Sound Exchange, we launched MDX about a year ago. We don't have revenue in the portal. This is about getting data exchanged between the record label and the music publisher before the release. But just in the past year, we've seen great adoption. We have all the major record labels and music publishers using the site. We have about 300 labels and 500 publishers registered. So we're seeing really good adoption trends there. And I think we have about 2,000-ish works a month where we're getting split information cycling through the site. So just in terms of adoption in the industry, it's been going really well.
I'd just like to add that Music Reports created the first electronic portal for mechanical licensing that I'm aware of. In 2009, we had been serving the on-demand streaming industry for several years already, but there was no royalty rate set yet by the CRB. So we recorded all of the usage and held it in abeyance, except for the voluntary licenses that we had been accounting, from the very beginning of those services. But everyone who was licensed under 115 needed to get paid in 2009 all of a sudden. So we built a web infrastructure. It's musicreports.com, and every publisher has a free account there. All they have to do is log in, and they can see every license that's ever been issued against their catalog, all their catalog as we show it in the Songdex registry, the history of all statements that have been paid to them. They can set their payment preferences, etc. I think there are 150,000 publishing administrators that use that portal now, representing 350,000 distinct catalogs of musical compositions. And they receive payments through that system for mechanical rights, but also for other types of rights in some cases where we service companies that need, UGC rights or video rights or education rights, that kind of thing.
Vicky, you had mentioned that you thought some of the portals might be difficult to use for some of a less sophisticated DIY user. Do you want to maybe speak to that a little more?
Yeah, I think that we have 130,000 publishers in the U.S., something along those lines. If you go down to the the songwriters who are self-published, so we have such a wide mix. It's a huge tent. And there is, in general, I think, a lack of tools for the mid-level to small publishers out there. And I do feel like, building out the MLC will hopefully open up more tools for that cross-section. They can't all afford the software that the bigger publishers use. So they're working with spreadsheets, and they're working with really lack of information. And so if you think about, if you're a composer and you go into a portal and then you have to click through and you say, oh, that looks like my song, but I should listen to it. You have to listen, and then you can log it. And
I guess I don't know how to make that simpler. Then you could search by song title or your name and listen to it. Right. I don't know. It's a high volume. That's the challenge. Like we can't make the problem simpler because
well, I think the problem would be simpler if we had more proactive registration and more active registration out in the
and they
community.
wouldn't be in the claiming portal. Yeah.
Right, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so then we start cleaning that up, people put that information in once, and then it just continues to improve over time. And I think we should, have a goal with these claiming portals, that we're trying to reduce them so that we don't have to do this, because what ends up happening is kind of the same thing as the unattributed royalties. Is it's too labor intensive. Everyone's told there's not that much money in there. There's too much time, and so people don't bother. And then, the money just ends up getting settled by market share anyway.
And to Bill's point, though, I don't think there is a technology shortage here, right? There's actually a lot of good solutions. It's driving everyone to a single point and with the knowledge of how to use them. I mean, the law drives some of the complexity about what you need to know about your copyrights, or that you need to know the difference that you sign up for a PRO versus mechanicals versus, right? I wrote a song and I'm 16, and there's a lot of responsibility when the gatekeepers go away. So there's a pro and con of both ways. So now it's really, I think, mostly about education and the support for that.
I agree with everything you said, but I just want to
heard a
point
but.
out that, just to go back to Elisa's comment earlier about this being a very, very narrow thing that we're talking about today. We're talking about U.S. Mechanical Rights Administration for on-demand streaming companies. And the same group of publishers that needs to manage this set of their publishing information needs to manage that across performance rights and synchronization rights and print rights in every territory of the world, and they need to find systems that are holistic and work for them. And so while it would be lovely to say that everybody shall use one portal that exists worldwide and everyone shall use it, that's just not reality. And so while it's important, and I absolutely am 100% behind the educational effort that's the essence of the MMA in my view, to get everyone focused on sending their data to the Mechanical Licensing Collective so they can solve this part of their problem, we should not confuse them into believing that they don't have other obligations to look out for.
Well, yeah, and we also need to have interoperability of all these silos all over the world. And we're starting to see things around data sharing that I think would have been heresy, even 5 years ago. The PPL initiative where they're, aggregating a data exchange. And this is because I think the industry in general is saying, wow, okay, we're losing revenue. We are not able to deliver the metadata that enables the user to find what they're looking for, and we're just not able to serve this mass explosion of creators. And so, I don't think that it's conceivable that the MLC is going to be a company, an organization that can solve all of this. But I think it will go exponentially further if we have interoperability and systems that will be a layer between the MLC and others around the world.
There will be an ecosystem that grows around this, right? There's going to be companies, and there are some now, where you register your compositions with them, and their job is to deliver the data to the multiple places. It's not just going to be the MLC. It's going to be PROs. It's going to be lyric services and tablature services and whatever else gets invented as I'm speaking, of how rights of a song are going to get exploited. So there is still going to be, a support. I mean, HFA has been around for 90 years, and we don't just do digital. We do physical product. We do, all the different things that that even Bill was talking about. So it's not. You try to make it as simple and one-stop shop as possible for somebody, so they can focus on their art and not getting a publishing deal or getting a,
We're nearly out of time.
I'm sorry, I'll stop talking.
No, it's no problem. I just want to make sure we come back quickly to MDX since we didn't get to really talk about it that much. If Ali want to expand on it, or if Ed or Jay want to talk about their experience using it, coming from a publisher and a label and sharing their data back and
maybe
forth.
I can just explain it at a high level, and then if Jay and Ed want to maybe speak to how it's working in practice. So, and I apologize that I lost people with all these acronyms, so I'll try to make this as clear as possible. Let's say a month before a release is going to enter the market, Jay's team will send all of the recording data to MDX. So ISRCs, artist, track titles, product information, release date. Here are all the writers we know about. Here are some of the publishers we know about. So all of that information will come to MDX in a message. MDX will then take that information and parse it and say, okay, this needs to go to UMPG and their team for publishing splits. This needs to go to Cobalt in their team for publishing splits. So then UMPG and Cobalt will log into MDX and provide their splits based on the recording data and the publishing data that the label knows about at the time before the release. So then when those publishers provide their splits, we're messaging that information back to the label to say, here are the shares, here is how you can go about getting a license, and then just kind of completing that exchange of data. And we're now working on LODs and trying to simplify and standardize that process so that when catalogs change hands, rather than publishers, shotgun blasting emails to 50 different licensees saying, hey, I've just acquired this catalog, they can do that in MDX. And at that point, it's targeted messages to the interested parties saying rights have changed hands.
Sorry, can you just say what an LOD is?
Oh, yep, a letter of direction. So when a publisher acquires a new catalog or there's a new administration deal, a letter of direction is sent to interested parties saying, please start paying us for this publishing catalog and these shares.
I'll just add, from the label perspective, we're pretty happy with it. It was really an effort to kill email once and for all. But as I mentioned earlier, the labels clear directly, work by work, share by share, and it was traditionally, much of it was via email. And waiting for the response. And so a whole process, an unstructured process. And MDX was a great way. It's a collaboration between the publishers and the labels to create a portal to communicate and to structure that. We used DDEX as well, which I'll just mention is another successful collaboration in the industry between publishers and labels. For the licensing working group was trying to attack that issue and create standards and, as Mark said, a choreography for how to share, license and share information. So MDX allowed us to get that into reality. And the benefits of it doesn't solve the problem of timing and all the issues of data itself, but it gives a platform that shows transparently what is going on. And it allows us to not say, oh, I need to send a follow-up email or do this. So, and it gives some metrics that are very interesting as well. So, in that regard, you cannot help but think it's a improvement and a move forward.
Yeah, I think it's great for record companies, and it's good for publishers. It's great for record companies because, as Jay pointed out, before you had MDX, they had to send an email to every single publisher on a composition. Now MDX does that for them, so it's one point of entry for them, and it goes out. For publishers, it's good because it first it is one point of entry for those labels that use MDX. Not all labels use it, so we're still doing emails with other labels. But it gives us a place where we can go for those labels who use MDX and immediately know the status of any license, and that's really or status of any clearance. And that's really nice. And what I love about it is that it does result in this back-end database of a match between a sound recording and a musical composition that you know is authoritative, and it has all of the associated metadata. And unfortunately, it's only working, obviously, with respect to those labels and publishers that are using it and for new compositions, but it's a great start.
Yeah, what's really beneficial to publishers, which is what we've heard, is because we're storing local work IDs that the publishers have, in addition to ISWCs.
And the labels have their own work IDs.
And the labels have their
yes.
own work
And
IDs, which
IS-
we
all have our own-
ISWC
we all
comes
have our own
later.
work
we have
IDs.
all the identifiers
We
in
map,
MDX. So
we map these things
Right.
by doing as we wait.
yeah, give us all the IDs.
We're about 5 minutes over on time now.
One thing I will say, so you can search any of these identifiers in MDX, and what's returned to you is all of the recording data for that work, all of the writers, all of the original publishers that were provided, all of the splits, all of the product information, the release date, all of the ISRCs. It's all there for you in one place. So just having that sort of centralized and aggregated in one place has been very beneficial.
Great, thank you all.
Sorry.
Sorry, Sarah, I'll give you the
kinda-
last word.
One sentence. The most promising thing I heard on this panel today was that ISWCs as a work identifier are going to be made available sooner. And so I just put out there that I hope that there's a plan also for reaching self-published and smaller, independent copyright owners and giving them that same opportunity to access that identifier at an earlier point in the process. So.
Great, thank you. I just want to thank all our panelists.
Thank you.